The following story is about lost treasure, but not gold or silver. This treasure is in the form of a forgotten military cache still waiting to be discovered, and possibly worth a small fortune. When I first heard this incredible tale, I admit it sounded too good to be true. But as my research tools improved over the years, I am now convinced that the source of this information was telling the truth. I've never publicly disclosed his secret until now. I'll need to backtrack just a little before we get to the main story. When I was 13, my father was transferred from Fairbanks to the state capital, Juneau. For the outdoors enthusiast, Southeast Alaska is a paradise. He bought a 27-foot bayliner and was on the water every chance he got. We soon heard about a great spot for halibut fishing in the icy strait, located about 50 nautical miles west of Auk Bay Harbor, where our boat was moored. It became one of our favorite playgrounds, and we explored the nearby excursion inlet on many occasions. Near the existing cannery, I remember seeing several huge pylons sticking out of the shoreline that appeared to be part of an old wharf. There was also an overgrown road heading north along the shore. I just assumed they were leftovers from a previous cannery and never gave it much thought. Now we'll fast forward 10 years. I had moved to Anchorage and was working with an old sourdough I'll call Jack. Sourdough is slang for a long-term survivor of the Alaskan winters. Now, old Jack had an endless supply of hunting and fishing adventure stories, and he'd often share them with me during our breaks. One day, he mentioned that he'd spent some time living in Juneau and a small nearby town called Gustavus. That's how the locals pronounce it. I pointed out that I too had lived in Juneau and spent lots of time fishing the icy strait and excursion inlet. He got this strange little grin on his face, then leaned in close and said, "I'm going to tell you a secret I've kept for 50 years. And of course, he had my undivided attention. Jack told me that his family had moved to Juneau in the 1920s and later moved to a homestead in Gustavus in the late 30s. His father raised cattle on a small farm, and one of Jack's responsibilities was bounty hunter. The area is plentiful with brown bear, and they developed a taste for the easy-access beef. He described how he made traps out of dynamite baited with dead fish. Explosives are still a common tool for people living in the sticks, and Jack had become an expert employing them by the tender age of 16. His experience here will come into play later. He continued how in June of 1942, the Japanese bombed military bases at Dutch Harbor and seized control of 2 islands in the Aleutian chain, which I'd learned in junior high. He said the military soon assembled in Gustavus to construct an airfield and took over a nearby cannery to build a base of operations at Excursion Inlet. Jack and his best friend were both strongly encouraged to volunteer for the Territorial Guard, and they became part of the work detail. He said he was having the time of his life. He learned how to operate and repair all kinds of tractors and heavy equipment, got to hang out with the soldiers, and even had access to explosives that he called the good stuff. But barely a year later, the facility was no longer needed, and they brought in some German prisoners to dismantle the base. He said the POWs and most of the soldiers were eventually transferred down to Washington State, with only a small team of soldiers left behind. Jack said the corporal in charge of the remaining detachment was concerned about military equipment they still had in storage, much of it unopened. Crates of rifles packed in oil rags, ammo cans, a couple of crated jeeps, a trailer-mounted arc welder, a track vehicle, and other items they couldn't risk leaving behind for looters or didn't have the means to transport. Someone suggested that they stash the surplus gear in an abandoned mine nearby and cover the opening with a rock slide. That way, if the army ever needed to account for the hardware, it would be there waiting. The corporal approved and decided he was ready to leave. It was late November and everyone was eager to shut the place down to go home for the holidays. On his way out, he instructed his remaining crew, along with Jack and his friend, to use a cutting torch to disable the weapons and vehicle engines before stashing them. They hauled the gear up to the mine, but the soldiers wanted to leave the final demo work to the local boys. Jack said they agreed to finish the job under the condition that they could each save a rifle for themselves. So, he and his friend each took an M1 rifle and several ammo cans, and the remaining soldiers flew out. Jack confessed that they didn't bother disabling the equipment as agreed, though. They just covered the mine opening with corrugated steel panels and blasted the ridge above to bury it, which he claimed was very effective. By now, I couldn't help but think he was simply embellishing. I asked Jack if he still had the rifle, and he didn't hesitate to invite me over to his house to check it out after work. I'm no expert, but it definitely looked authentic. I still wasn't convinced about the cached equipment, though. I'd never heard about a military base at Excursion Inlet or German POWs, and it sounded like nothing more than a tall tale. Sadly, Jack passed away a few years later. At some point in the early 2000s, I was reading an article about the Japanese occupation in the Aleutian chain and noticed a reference to German POWs and Excursion Inlet. It was only then that I discovered the official record of that facility, and the report was far more detailed than what Jack had described. The Army Corps of Engineers had indeed constructed a barge terminal in Excursion Inlet to transfer cargo to the Western defenses, and after the terminal was no longer needed, German POWs were sent in to salvage 12 million board feet of lumber before the site was abandoned in November 1945. Still, that didn't lend any credibility to the hidden cache part of his story. So why do I believe Jack's testimony now? Just a few years ago, a friend inherited a mining claim and he sent me a link to an interactive map. It showed every claim in the entire state, so I tried zooming into Excursion Inlet. And bang, there it was. The Alaska Silver King Mine, fitting the location Jack described. It was listed as a surface and underground operation and included the coordinates. The description of workings included a 3,000-foot aerial tram and a 2-mile road to the deepwater docks. A quick Google search led me to survey reports going back more than 80 years. Some of the original publications aren't currently viewable online, unfortunately, but are cited in later accounts. In 1949, the first report by R.L. Thorne of the U.S. Bureau of Mines confirmed the property was first located in 1938. It was excavated along a deep-walled creek at an elevation of 1,070 feet, developed with trenches, trails, and an aerial tram. He concluded that no additional work is evident or reported. A 1985 investigation by Albert Clough and Terry Hayden added, "No signs of the initial prospecting activity were apparent, and no evidence of any more recent activity was observed. The lack of historical workings is not surprising since the prospect lies in the middle of a major avalanche path." A follow-up report by Albert Clough and Earl Redman in 1989 added that an open cut, 30 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, had been excavated originally in 1938. They stressed that the Bureau was unable to locate the original workings of this mine due to dense vegetation and years of avalanche activity. So to summarize, in 1938, trails to the mine were created, trenches were excavated, and a tram installed. In 1945, Jack and his friends supposedly sealed the mine with a rock slide. Yet, by 1949, they can't locate any of the original workings, and subsequent reports add that the site is covered by avalanche debris. It sounds like Jack might have been telling the truth after all. I wish I had this last bit of information when I was still able to investigate it for myself. But now, maybe someone else is willing to put this mystery to rest. Just save me a rifle. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share.